this video, I'll be breaking down exactly how I shot a high-speed dirt biking ad in the middle of the desert with a crew of 3 people, 1 Sony FX3, 1 drone in 4 hours. We'll cover everything that went right and everything that went wrong and how you can do the same on a low budget or even for free if you already have a camera. This was by far the most challenging project I've ever done. From the dust to the timing of the sunset to chasing the bike over 60 miles an hour, which is why the first step was coming up with a pre-production plan. Every good video starts with planning, and this one was no different, especially since I've never shot in the desert and I'd only been riding a dirt bike for 2 weeks. I had to figure out how we were going to capture the speed and the raw emotion of riding a dirt bike while actually being able to keep up and stay safe at the same time. Not to mention coming out of it with all of my equipment in one piece, which you'll see in a second barely happened. Normally for automotive work like this, you have what's called a chase car, but you can't really do that for a bike unless we have an off-road truck rigged up. So that was out of the picture. I settled on planning for most of these shots to be either a camera strapped to the bike, which is sketchy, or me just standing there with the camera, which is boring. So the key was to mix those shots evenly to maintain a sort of pacing to the video. To see what this would actually look like, I started by looking up frames from ads, movies, and music videos to put them together in a storyboard, and then made note of what equipment we would need in order to achieve that same look. For the stationary shots, I rented out a 200mm lens so we could do these quick whip pans that really emphasize speed. And for the bike shots, I ordered 3 magic arms with clamps, hoping that we could clamp my FX3 to the bike itself. Once I had a plan in mind, the next step was to find somewhere to actually shoot the ad. So the week before, we headed out in the desert to scout a location the boys had in mind. We got there, unloaded the truck, and started riding. And as soon as we were riding, I saw this great vantage point where I could plan out how everything was gonna go down, and was even able to plan around where the sun would be with the Sunseeker app, which was critical because light will affect your window of time to shooting. After riding down the ridgeline, I rigged the FX3 onto the front of my bike to test out this shot I had in mind that gave kind of this FPV feel to it. And I let the guys take it for a quick rip, and it seemed like it was safe enough to use, so now we were ready to go. Now all we needed to do was wait for the shoot day. Except there was one small, or I guess really big issue, which is we didn't even end up shooting in the same location, even remotely at all. Tony, the guy whose rapper we took out, was out of town, and I was only in Arizona for 1 more week. So Cam, who was the one riding the dirt bike for the ad, suggested a spot to shoot, and I literally went into the shoot blind. I had no idea where the sun would set, what obstacles would get into our way, or what lines I could even follow to shoot the bike, especially with the drone. The only thing I knew was what time the sun would set. So I did the only logical thing I could think of, which is I just started shooting. We got the first few shots of Cam biking around with no plan other than us just talking through the comm systems that were in the helmets, and everything was working out until I got the drone out and realized we had a massive issue.
All right, so I rented this drone last night and forgot to get NDs for it. So we're gonna see if the drone shots even work.
Not having NDs on the drone meant that I had to crank the living hell out of the shutter to get the exposure right so we would have motion blur on the shot. And although we got a usable shot, it just wasn't up to my standards. After the drone situation, we got some incredible frames to end the day with of Cam riding up to the ridge on a point where we could pretend like he's watching the sunset. And it was a wrap until I reviewed the footage and realized we didn't even have enough for a 30-second ad. So at this point, we had gone out for 1 day, and because the sun sets so fast, we really only had about 2 hours of shooting. And with what happened with the drone and us actually scouting out shots on the new location, that 2 hours very, very quickly turned into maybe an hour of shooting time if you also include changing lenses and all the other stuff we did. So at this point, I thought that we were totally screwed as I was reviewing the footage and we didn't have enough. But then Cam had an idea in mind. He called up his friend Danny that lives in San Diego, and Danny flies FPV drones and he's been doing it since he was 7. And he ended up driving to Scottsdale from San Diego overnight and got to Scottsdale the next morning at 8 a.m. So once Danny arrived, we went back the next day for round 2. This time I knew mostly where we were shooting, but we were missing a super important establishing shot from day 1 because there weren't enough cactus by us, which was a big part of the video. As Cam and I were riding out into the cactus, Cam's Kickstarter flew off of his bike and we lost it in the desert. Luckily, after a few minutes, he found it and kept shooting, but we were kind of far from where Danny was going to meet us, so the clock really started ticking on what we could do with the shoot. We got back to the location where Danny met us and we threw him on the back of the dirt bike to drive a little bit out to where we could start flying, and immediately got the drone up with zero plan. And if you don't know, FPV drone batteries only last about 6 to 7 minutes, and Danny had 2 batteries with him, so that is all of the resources that we had to work with. On the first FPV battery, I told them both to drive and fly as fast and as crazy as they possibly could, and we ended up actually getting some pretty incredible shots with the Osmo 4, thanks to actually having ND filters this time. On the second FPV battery, we went further out in the cactus, so there were actually good obstacles to fly around, and Danny got some of the best shots that he has ever gotten on his FPV drone, and he's been flying since he was 7. The only issue is that when Danny is looking through the FPV goggles, he sees a live feed that's separate from what the action cam is recording. And he crashed twice and we thought it was all good until he flew the drone back and we realized that the battery had came out of the Osmo. So now with no battery life left on the Osmo and the FPV drone, we might have been totally screwed. I didn't bring an extra battery for the Osmo for whatever reason to the shoot, so we had no idea if the second flight even turned out. But by the time that we landed the drone, the sun had pretty much already set, so that was a complete wrap on the shoot for the 2 days. Then it was time to go and check the footage and see if we actually got something usable. From start to finish, this was the most technical ad that I have ever put together, but I could not be more proud of the way it turned out, especially for the time constraint and the concept and the budgets that we were working with, which, if I didn't make that clear, the budget was just me. I was the producer, so it was not really much at all.